Good evening, Shavua Tov. I hope you all had just a wonderful Shabbat and we're ready to return to very, very real world kind of issues. So just to review a little bit, because we've been doing other things for a while to get us back in mind. Obviously, we're talking about Torah and the internet. We're talking about how social media in particular works, what is a Torah-based or religious response to this new phenomenon in the world, this social media that, as we've been demonstrating, not only poses grave dangers to our psyches, our culture, our world, but it also retains some of the profound promise with which social media was greeted with when it first came out. We have to somehow manage, as always in such issues, we have to manage a balance here. So in the interest of that balance, what we talked about, first we started off with the discussion, what is artificial intelligence? This seems a very basic issue. And after that, on Thursday, we spent a long day and an important day. We looked at the remarkable documentary film, The Social Dilemma, and we had some discussion. And then we looked in more depth at the issues raised in that documentary. We heard from Dr. Sam Lightstone, a very senior technology officer in that realm, about how it works. Then we heard from Professor Henry Abramson, our dear friend from Touro College, who totally gave us a context for what's going on today with other media revolutions in history and so forth. And we heard from his cybersecurity attorney, Franklin Zemmel. I still will get back and try all those tricks he showed us to see just how frightened I get by what you all can know about me. And then we heard from Rabbi Dov Shochet. The issue with the kind of persuasion the internet and social media do is that it works without our conscious awareness. It is persuasion not in the sense of discussion of ideas and logic and so forth, but it's something that goes much deeper into the psyche and affects us. So there's a feeling that this all is invading our privacy. So to even have this, just as we had when we talked about artificial intelligence, so we had to discuss what is intelligence, now we have to talk about privacy. And Rabbi Shochet took us through many of our traditional perspectives on the issue of privacy. Finally, Thursday evening, if you weren't upset enough by that point, we talked about how social media affects our minds. We started with Dr. Avram Steinberg talking about how it affects us neurologically. Then we talked with Dr. Norman Goldwasser, who talked about the psychology of PTSD, of trauma, and of addiction more than anything else. And then we heard from Rabbi Pinchas Taylor, who works with dreams and dream interpretation in his work. And he was talking about how we no longer have the private space in our psyches to dream anymore. So it's getting to us, my friends. But now, to try to have some balance on the issue, we're going to talk about what was that promise we all intuited as soon as we got on Facebook. A good example of that promise is what we're doing here the past few days, is that we are bringing people together that cannot, for various reasons, be together in real life. And we're all learning and discussing and interchanging. And I think I mentioned the past couple of weeks, I've given lectures in, in Israel, naturally, in India, in Sri Lanka, and on Friday morning in Pakistan. So we're able to connect with other people and other cultures as never before. So We're going to hear first from Dr. Margarita Quihuis from Stanford. I will introduce her momentarily, who's going to tell us about her efforts. She knows how persuasion works with social media. She knows very well, but she's saying now we can use that persuasion for socially productive ends. And she will talk about how she works in this area. We will then hear from Rabbi Motti Seligson. He runs Chabad.org, which is the oldest, I believe, or certainly one of the oldest internet portals of a religious organization. And indeed, I think characteristically of Chabad, the moment the internet was there, Chabad was using it in order to spread knowledge of Judaism and Hasidus and for positive purposes. So we're going to hear the history of Chabad.org and how it works. And at the end, we're going to hear from Dr. Menachem Feuer from Canada. And he has an academic career, but then he's recently branched off into teaching coding and other IT things to observant, Orthodox, even Haredi young people who can find a way to earn a living in an honorable method and at the same time maintain their religious integrity. So there's three ways, and then Rabbi Lipskar and I will wrap up a bit. So, my friends, Dr. Margarita Quihuis. Now, I'm sure you'll remember from the video we showed some of the very crucial work being done at the Stanford University Persuasion Research Institute. And we reached out to the institute who directed us to Dr. Quihuis to address the kind of issues that we want to have addressed. Dr. Quihuis is the CEO of PeaceX Ventures. I'm not sure what this means. She'll tell us. The first venture studio dedicated to building ESG native companies from the ground up. We'll hear about it. The next one I do understand. She's the executive director of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford University and the Peace Innovation Institute that is based in The Hague, I guess, in the Netherlands. She divides her time between academia and corporate engagement. She remains involved with the Stanford Persuasion Institute as a research team member in Professor B.J. Fogg's Behavior Design Lab. And she combines behavioral change, persuasive technology, and finance for real world import. So I'm excited to hear, how can we tame this beast? This Frankenstein monster has got out of control. How do we regain some control? How do we get it to serve the goals we think should be served? Please, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Quihuis to our conference. Margarita.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It is a pleasure to present to all of you. And I know that the last few days in terms of learning about AI and how the technology has been misused, the lack of privacy is terrifying, and with good reason. Absolutely. In our work, we have seen the weaponization of technology, but there is also hope. So let me share my screen and I will give you a little bit of background and context of our lab and show you some of the direction where things can go. So let us begin. So the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford, what we do is we draw on the fields of behavior design, persuasive technology, game design thinking, neuroscience, economics, and business. And we're looking to create new systems, frameworks, and tools for practitioners. So we're very applied innovation, applied research oriented. We have that. We don't publish papers behind a firewall that no one will read. We want to create tools that people can use. And we're looking to create positive peace and need to tie it to economic value and really increasing people's ability to be good with each other at scale. Now, why this came about, in 2007, B.J. Fogg taught the Facebook class. And if you Google New York Times Facebook class, you will see an article about it. 2007 was a very interesting year. It was the year the iPhone came out. It was the year that Facebook opened up its platform to third-party developers. It was the year that there were a number of analytics tools available, including Google Analytics. What's important about that point in time is that if you think about how people use technology in the 1990s, you bought Microsoft Office, it came in a big box, it cost $500, it had 10 CDs and 2 pounds of manuals that nobody read. And when you installed the software, Microsoft got paid, boom, just like that. But they had no idea how many times you opened off Microsoft Word, which features you used in Microsoft Excel, or the number of emails that you sent out in Outlook. We didn't have any kind of visibility in terms of customer behavior. By 2007, we were able to see what people were doing on the internet. And then like in 2004, 2005, 2006, it was fairly crude. We could see that, someone went to your website because you could see that you got a hit on it. You could see how long they stayed there. Oh, they were there for 0.5 seconds. You could see the number of visitors and you could get an idea of where they were geographically based on the IP address. And that was about it. Then you have the iPhone, then you have Facebook analytics, and all of a sudden we can actually see people's behavior, what they're doing on these devices, what they're doing on these platforms at a much more granular scale. And that was the moment when BJ Fogg wrote a paper on mass interpersonal persuasion, saying we have entered a new era. Prior to this era, the only people that had this mass interpersonal persuasion were heads of state, if you were a media mogul, or a religious figure. To have that kind of platform to move people to take some kind of action. Broadcast media, if you ran CBS or ABC or NBC, if you're Walter Cronkite, you could do that. All of a sudden, with this shift in this power dynamic, we could see that individuals could persuade other individuals because they were connected through a social network. And with Facebook analytics, we could see that behavior move through the network. And that was why that class was such a breakthrough. When BJ saw this, he said, if we can get people, and I don't know if you were on Facebook at the time, but if we could get people to poke each other and do some silly thing, could we work on something as big as world peace? And given the BJ's background in experimental and behavioral psychology, we started saying, okay, how might we do that? So we're in this era of mass interpersonal persuasion. There's sensors everywhere. They're in your pocket, in your iPhone, the webcam on the corner of the building, in your car, it's everywhere. It's all gathering all this behavior data. So we can measure what people are doing in their everyday lives, but now we can begin to deconstruct what peace looks like for the first time. And we're able to systematically design and test pro-social behavior at scale. So with that, there are going to be new business models around that are relying on human behavior, as we well know. And so in our lab, we are, since we were incubated within the persuasive technology lab, our mandate is say, how do we use this technology to create more stability, more pro-social behavior, more positive peace in the world? So that's what we're after, that's what we're doing. So our agenda in our lab and what we're looking to do is threefold. One is we want to catalyze a peace tech sector and industry. Just as you have enterprise software, you have AI, you have medical devices, clean tech, and so on. We want to create a new category called peace tech. We want to create new frameworks and curriculum for the ethical and safe deployment of emerging technologies and innovations. And we want to establish a market signal for the value of peace. And we're doing this through our peace data standard. Why? Because right now, people don't see the cause and effect of how so stable societies are actually good for the economy. It's kind of a no-brainer, but you need to, for the people who need the numbers, we're going to have to say, this is the ROI. for investing in peace. This is the ROI for why you want to have people treating each other well. So the programs that we have around this is the Hague Peace Data Standard. We are working with engineering schools to develop the new field of peace engineering. It's a different way of thinking. It's a systems level way of thinking where engineers begin to think of the ethical consequences of what they're innovating and building. And then, of course, we want to prove that peace is profitable. So we want to create new financial instruments where you can invest in peace. So our toolkit, behavior design, this comes out of BJ Fogg's lab. Persuasive technology, which is all the devices and sensors that are out there that are that can move people to take action, that can shape behavior, record it, and reinforce it. And then, of course, the peace data. So moving on. Let's see. In our lab, the fundamental research question that we ask is, how good can we be to each other? It's a very simple question, but it's not simplistic because we think, how can I be a better person to you? How can we have a better interaction? And what does that look like? In the non-technology, non-mediated world, we have social protocols for that, and we have customs for that. In this digital space that we've been really immersed in during the pandemic, if you weren't a remote worker before or interacting with mediating technologies on a day-to-day basis, I think we've all have had hours a day interacting with people that we don't have any physical contact with. These technologies can shape how good that interaction can be. So we want to think about it. Let's see. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first one is called Besties. In 2008, 2009, we started talking to Facebook about their peace footprint and saying, we believe that you're creating peace, but you don't know it. And so we started looking at what data they had that might illustrate that point. And so they created a page called peace.facebook.com, which they maintained for a number of years. If you Google it now, you won't find it because they haven't maintained it. But the premise was they were looking at the number of unique friendships that happened on a daily basis across some sort of a conflict boundary. So they would track the number of people who identified as coming from Israel, making a friendship, a new friendship from people in the Palestinian territory, Pakistanis and Indians, Ukraine and Russia, Republicans and Democrats, and they had all these different divisions just to look at what that data looked like. What was revolutionary about this at that time was that for the first time, we could measure this tiny peace behavior. When you read or hear the news about Israel and the Palestinian territory, you would get the impression that those two communities, it would be impossible for any friendships to emerge across that conflict boundary. And yet, on this platform, we could see that people were friending each other. Now, can't speak to the quality of that friendship, but they were willing to publicly acknowledge that they were Facebook friends with each other. And that was the first time we could begin to measure that kind of behavior at scale. When we looked at the friending data as time went by, we looked at the level of new friendships that occurred in November of 2012, it was during the Operation Pillar Defense. And we looked at how the friending behavior changed over time. And this graph will illustrate what it was. So at the peak, on the 23rd, you could see that friendships go up again. As the ceasefire goes into play, the friendships resume, and in fact, they peak higher than what they were when the rockets started attacking. Now, this is just sort of curious data. It gives you a counterpoint to the news. News, by definition, it gets your attention because it's unusual. The boring stuff of peace doesn't get reported because what are you going to say? Everyone got along. again, when we have social instruments like this, we can begin to detect other types of human behavior. So this was, and of course, Facebook has gone off the rails since then, but certainly in 2008, 2009, we had a lot of hope that it could be used as a force for good. And Facebook is a mixed bag. Next. The next story is called Play Nice. When we think about online video game platforms, there is, if you want to Google hostile online environments, these multiplayer platforms can be just hotbeds of toxicity. Riot Games, one of the chief innovation officers there, Jeff Lynn, was looking at the toxicity on the platform and wondered, is it our responsibility to do anything about this? Can we do anything about this? And so he, as a trained psychologist, put together a team and said, we are going to test what we can do to increase civility on this platform. And they didn't, and because they're working with millions of players all over the world, their data set was enormous, and they could apply a variety of different techniques to see what worked and what didn't, and even combinations of techniques. And so this is some of the data that they came up with, and they were able to measurably improve the interactions of the players by changing the user experience online. So when we talk about a mediating technology, it's not neutral. You can tune it to either bring out the worst in people or to bring out the best in people. And in this case, they were able to do that empirically. We can see the data. We can see what works and what doesn't. The opportunity there is huge. And one of the consequences of this research is in the video game industry is that they decided to put together a consortium called the Fair Play Alliance. This gave me a lot of hope. This is where game designers come together to share research and best practices to encourage healthy community growth and fair play. There is also a corollary industry alliance around safety on video game platforms. So people from Roblox, Minecraft and others have come together because they want to make sure that those platforms become safer for youth and for children. So there is an emergence now because we've been able to see the bad actions that have happened, and they have the data that, how can we start to design countermeasures to make it safer? The last story is called Strangers in the Night. So if I was to go to you and say, what is it worth to get millions of people to engage in a hospitality behavior? Now, in the pre-COVID days, when I would give this talk, I would ask a raise of hands, how many of you would allow a perfect stranger into your home? And typically nobody raises their hand. And I said, okay, if I offer you $50, will you have a stranger in your home? 100, 200, what does it take? And some people might inch their hand up. How do you get to do that? How do you get millions of people to trust a perfect stranger at scale? It's hard to do that interpersonally, but technology platforms give us that ability. And when we think about what trust might be worth, Airbnb is built around that hospitality behavior of saying, I'm going to bring someone into my home. Certainly in the early years, it's gotten more commercial since then. Their valuation of that trust behavior was $31 billion. 2 million listings, 191 countries. Half of the home hosts are women. And so you can see that by being able to allow people to engage in a pro-social hospitality behavior, a positive behavior, you can create enormous economic value. The other interesting thing about Airbnb is that a couple of years ago, there was a concern about bias on the platform. So if you were a person of color, the host might not want to to give you the room. Now, of course, the room is perishable, because if nobody stays in your room tonight, you're out that money. So they started putting together a whole anti-bias training and toolkit for their hosts. What caught my attention was these hosts are in 191 countries. So they're tackling racism on a scale that a single government cannot do. So the civil rights legislation in the United States would not cover as many countries. It's just in the United States, but Airbnb, by changing their policies and saying we're only going to have hosts that are going to abide by this policy and they must be trained, has a huge potential of making the world a fairer place in that thin slice. Their motto at Airbnb is they want everyone to feel welcome and at home. So again, software algorithms to help us do that. When we look at the market value for peace and how we measure that, we realized that we needed to be able to create a data standard for software developers. So that way they could start to collect the data and interpret the data to see what the economic value of these positive interactions is. So the Hague Peace Data Standard is a first step in leveraging the power of big data and machine learning to understand when and how technology facilitates peace and positivity. So for my academic friends who, this is sort of academic red meat, data, tables, we can, I can give you a link to the paper later. What we did for this study is we looked at an Australian bank and we looked at the enterprise software that they used. We wanted to look at gender engagement, and within this network of the bank branches, the employee base was roughly 50-50 male, female. And we were curious to see through the communication software that they used, was there bias against women? How are men and women interacting? And it wasn't necessarily the content of the messaging, but just the frequency. It was just simple behavior like, if you're a guy manager, are you reading the woman's messages or not? Or are you preferentially reading the men's messages over women's messages, so on and so forth? And we were able to glean that behavior data just by looking at the communications traffic. And we were also able to see what the communication networks look like. So we could see if there were blockers, things that were preventing women from communicating or getting their work done through the social networks in the organization. So that's the power of how we can use this data in the workplace, because it turns out that for most of us, we spend 8 hours a day working for people who are very different from us, who are not related to us, that we're not married to, and it's at work. And so learning to get along with people who are different from ourselves is an economic activity. And here's just more data that we collected. And again, it was just the metadata of that communications platform. We could look at the level of cross-gender collaboration, which is also when we look at the UN Sustainability Development Goals, this plays into SDG 5, which is around gender and gender equality. So you can use the data in your enterprise software, the software that you use to run your organization, to see, is there equity, is there inclusion, is there fairness going on? So why do we want to collect the peace data? It allows us to reveal the unseen, invisible relationships and dynamics within those relationships. We're also looking to use this data to improve the quality of life, health, and social capital. And we can begin to determine the economic value of peace based on that. And lastly, because when I talk to a lot of companies, a lot of corporations, companies can be rewarded for the peace they create. And that is largely through what the Rabbi mentioned, ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing. So that is a new trend on Wall Street. They want to invest in companies that are ESG compliant, which means they have meet sustainability goals, they're meeting social impact goals around inclusion and equity, and then of course they have good governance. So how can we create the world that we want? When I talk to corporations and I say, how many of you are raising your hand and saying, I can't wait for the AI to make us all unemployed, or I can't wait for the robots to take over the world? No one ever raises their hand with enthusiasm. And I go, so if this isn't a heck yes, this is the world that we want to create, what is the world that we want to create? We have to not just sort of go with the flow and say, oh, this is inevitable, because quite frankly, the future hasn't been created yet. All we have is the present and the decisions that we make right now. And I always remind people of that, because if it's not a hell yes, then don't go there. Don't put your money, don't invest your time and your energy and your capital and everything in that world if that's not the world that you want to live in or the world that you want your children to live in. So to that end, I'm very deeply involved in the creation of peace engineering. And I think that reimagining how engineers are trained is critical, because certainly in Silicon Valley, engineers have an outsized influence and power in terms of creating the world that we're all going to end up living in. So how do we get them to design safe and ethical technologies? So, and what does that mean to design? So you want to proactively detect unintended uses and consequences of technology employment. And certainly now that we've had over a decade of experience with social media, we can't say, oh, I had no idea. Now we have a pretty good idea that technology will be weaponized. We have a pretty good idea that there will be reverse targeting. We have a pretty good idea that these things will happen. So any new technology that's going to come up, you have to test it against that. We know that there's bias. We need to look at the training data for AI. We need to establish data sets of good behavior for machine learning, because machines are kind of like toddlers. If the parents curse, guess what? Your kid's going to curse. So you have to watch out what the training data is that you're giving to the AI and to the machine. And we want to design safeguards concurrently with the technology development, rather than doing it after the fact. Got to put the brakes in the car. You don't want the car out on the street and say, oh, maybe someone should put brakes in that car. No, you got to do it at the same time. So here's some frameworks. This is the hope, okay? Because I want you to know that people are working on these issues. They are beginning to develop these frameworks. One of them that I love is Microsoft. They have a harms modeling framework for AI. It's a checklist for not only for code and product development, but I think it's great for designing business and work culture as well. It looks at, is this data, if you collect it, what is the risk of injury? What is the emotional risk? What is the psychological risk? What is the economic risk? What happens with human rights, you know, the environment and so on. And it just lays it all out. And so if you're developing AI, you can just look and say, okay, how are we hitting any of this? Does this apply? And if so, what are we going to do to fix that or to avoid that harm? Okay. Mira Lane, shout out to Mira Lane. She's the policy leader at ethics and policy at Microsoft. Another toolkit is called the Ethical OS, and is looking at how, again, for software developers, for technology entrepreneurs, to look at the 8 risk zones. So risk 1, truth, disinformation, and propaganda. 2, addiction in the dopamine economy. 3, economic and asset inequalities. 4, machine ethics and algorithmic biases. 5, surveillance state. 6, data control and monetization. 7, implicit trust and user understanding. And 8, hateful and criminal actors. So we're beginning to put together the systematic thinking for product developers and innovators to consider. Another one is called Ethics MVP, and this is for startup entrepreneurs and founders to think about how they're going to create their company so that it is ethical. What is the culture that they're going to cultivate of how they're going to build their products and services, how they're going to treat each other and their stakeholders. Ethics for designers. Again, the user interface, how do I do all of this, right? On and on and on. So I'm going to close here. What's next? Okay, so we've talked about AI and machine learning, and Mark Zuckerberg is going to invest, $10 billion in the metaverse. And we're going, we need to start thinking about how we want to create this digital world. So it's a safe world where we can thrive, where we treat each other well, where we bring out the best in each other. We screwed up Web 2.0. All right, we did. And as my father might say, we came by it honestly because people didn't know. Now we know. Now we know. So we need to get this next iteration. I'm not crazy about the metaverse, but if it's going to be built, how do we build it right? And with that, I am done. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. That was really striking. I have many, many, many questions, but I'll just say right now, without doubt, it seems to me that unless we, as the cliche goes, get outside the box, like Margarita is, we're trapped in the system. That somehow you have to have the ability to step outside and look at it, and from that perspective, try to recreate it as it's constantly being recreated anyway. And some of the techniques and standards that you shared with us are just amazing, just wonderful. I wonder, of course, how do you get people to buy in? Can we convince people that it's in their interest to be better people? That's a question. Can we convince people they ought to be better than they are, and it's in their interest to? That's a question that is eternal in religions and philosophies and in the kind of work you're doing. How do we get people to be, as my son likes to say, the best version of themselves that they can be? And if this extraordinarily powerful tool can get us in that way, that's fabulous. So very much appreciated. We'll get back to you as we move on in this discussion and get to some questions. But just especially in the light of everything we've been hearing, this is a fresh and crucial perspective on the work that you're doing. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce to you Rabbi Motti Seligson. I think it was around maybe 1990, maybe a little bit earlier, when I read an article in an academic journal called Chabad in Cyberspace. Now, back I knew what Chabad was, but cyberspace was still something new and fuzzy to me. I liked the article. We ended up hiring the guy who wrote it, in fact. He did other things too. I'm so interested because Chabad.org is the first, or one of the very first, major online presences for a religious organization. Yeah, people got into television and radio long before, but to use this technology, Chabad was among the very, very first, and certainly among the very most successful organizations at using the internet and social media to spread the message, as it were, to try to get people to be better than they are, to try to inspire people in that way. So we're going to hear from Rabbi Seligson. As I say, he's the Associate Director of Chabad.org, which is one of the world's largest faith-based websites with a reach of 54 million unique visitors. When you consider there may be 15 million Jews in the whole world, they're getting 54 million visitors. That's some measure of the eagerness of people for what Chabad.org offers. He also serves as Director of Media Relations for Chabad Lubavitch, and is often the media's go-to resource for things Jewish. And indeed, if you read widely, you'll see Motti in the news, in discussions regularly. He did a degree in religious studies, so I like him already, from the Rabbinical College of America, and was ordained as a rabbi at the Rabbinical College at Sydney, Australia. So I look forward to hearing. We heard plans for using the internet and social media positively with great success. Now we're going to hear from somebody who has experience in doing just that. Rabbi Seligson.
Thank you, Professor Katz. Thank you. So a good tvach, and again, thank you for having me. In 2011, the CIA used a drone strike to attack a individual in Yemen. This was a terrorist, and what was unique about this terrorist was that he recruited more people than anyone in English. Through his talks in English, he recruited an immense amount of people to do horrible things and rain terror around the world and perpetuate suffering. Now, the interesting thing about this is that since 2011, since the CIA took this extraordinary action, this individual recruited even more people. And this was all done through technology, through using technology through USB, through thumb drives and shared on FTP servers or burnt on CDs. And his talks went all over the world. Fast forward just a few years ago, a rabbi I know was traveling on the highway and stopped at a rest area. And out of a truck, which was parked just near where his car was, where his family was, a fellow walked out and asked this rabbi, "Do you know my rabbi?" And he looked at him a little puzzled, and he said, "Let's try this. We'll play some Jewish geography. Who's your rabbi?" And he said, "Rabbi Josh Gordon." Now, Rabbi Gordon passed away a few years before that. And he turned to this fellow and he said, "Do you know that Rabbi Gordon passed away?" So he said, "Sure, of course I do. But I learn with Rabbi Gordon every single day." Now, Rabbi Gordon recorded a full annual cycle of the daily Torah portion of that day with Rashi interpretation. He recorded a full cycle of Maimonides as the Rebbe encouraged people to study it, as well as Tanya, the deepest well springs of Torah learning, on a daily annual cycle. And here you have this fellow who, years after Rabbi Gordon passed away, was studying Torah for hours. Most of this individual's wake hours, the biggest part of his day, the lion's share of his day, he's sitting there listening and learning Torah as he's hauling cargo across the country. And that's an incredible feat. Rabbi Gordon has learned perhaps more Torah with people after his passing than at any time during his lifetime. And that's this inherent conflict that we have, this inherent challenge that we see with technology. And perhaps it's in the name of this conference, Torah and science. On the one hand, we have Torah, and on the other hand, we have science and technology, which could be used for all kinds of things, as we've heard throughout this conference. In fact, on the first day in the opening session of this conference, Professor Katz mentioned how we're all aware of what's happened with social media platforms that started out with immense promise, and the attempted election interference and the deep divides that we see within our society that stem from some of these platforms, from some of these technologies. So then, how do we use this for good? How do we use it? Do we even have a right to use it? Or are these things, as they say, treif, that we need to keep our distance from? Now, this is really not new. While we're dealing with social media platforms, this conference, we were talking about artificial intelligence, and these are all emerging technologies. The challenges of how technology influences our lives, influences our society, is not a new one. In fact, in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, or in the 70s, these were challenges that were being confronted as well. in some scholars will submit that the Vietnam War wasn't lost on the battlefield, but on American television sets and living rooms all across the United States. And that was technology having an impact on our society in a way that perhaps we didn't even realize at the time. And it was during that period that in the 1960s and in the 1970s that the Rebbe addressed this issue of technology. Of, first of all, are we permitted to use this? And if we are, how do we use it? And what is the nature of technology from a religious perspective, not just in practice? And as the panelists before me just mentioned, we see how technology is used in practical ways in a positive way. In fact, this evening, if you're watching this, you're participating in that endeavor of using these technologies in a positive way. And in a series of talks, in 4 talks actually, 2 in 1966 and 2 in 1977, the Rebbe addressed this and later published it in the 15th volume of Likutei Sichos, and in one essay. And in that essay, the Rebbe lays out that there are 3 categories here. There's one category where we see how all creation is created for a higher purpose, to be used for something greater. As it says in Pirkei Avot, in the ethics of our fathers, that everything that God created in his world, he did not to create, but for his glory. But that's a very general, vague, it's not very particular to technology. It refers to everything that we see in creation. Everything is to be used for in this positive way, in this positive endeavor, and bringing goodness and kindness and more godliness into the world. But the Rebbe goes further and cites a medrash that states that gold was not created only for the purpose of its use in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, or in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Rebbe links that to technology. And while we see all these horrible things that are done with gold, that have been done with gold, even looking straight in the Torah, you see the golden calf just after as the Torah is being given. We see some of those things with technology as well. But what's unique about that, the way the Rebbe learns this, that just as gold was created for a sole positive purpose, technology was also created for this positive, godly purpose, this godly endeavor. And the Rebbe takes it even further. The Rebbe makes the point that it wasn't just that it's not just that this technology is created in a way that it serves this greater purpose. It's actually a godly revelation itself. And it's a godly revelation in 2 ways. First of all sciences and the Rebbe learns this from a Zohar, that the realm of secular wisdom, as we know it today, the development of secular wisdom in what is permitted from the Torah perspective, is a godly revelation. And it also serves as an example to understand what the godly permeation throughout the world actually means, in a way that as human beings we could understand this. And the Rebbe goes to Kabbalah, and bear with me for a moment, tighten your seatbelts here. We're going to look at a piece of the Zohar to understand this. And no turbulence, I hope. But the Rebbe looks at, or the Rebbe looks at a Zohar that looks at a piece of the Torah from the portion of Noah, and in the Torah, it relates in the 600th year of Noah's life, all the well springs of the awesome depth, right? Remember, we're talking about the well springs of the depths of the earth burst forth, and the portals of the heaven opened, right? So we have the water coming from on high in the story of Noah, from the heavens, and they're coming from below, and they're flooding the world. Now, the Zohar looks at that, and the Zohar translates that, or on that verse, the Zohar relates in the 600th year of the 6th millennia, the floodgates of the supernal wisdom, right? Translating the floods from on high as the supernal wisdom will open, and the well springs of the lower wisdom, referring to more mundane or to mundane wisdoms, will burst forth. And here's a fascinating point to all of this. And the Zohar continues to prepare the world to enter the 7th millennia. Now, what the 7th millennia is referring to is the times of Mashiach, the revelations of Mashiach, at a time when godliness is revealed in a very clear sense, in a way that us mortals could comprehend it and see it and experience it and tap it with our fingers, so to speak. And what the Rebbe looks at as the supernal wisdom is this revelation in these years referred to in the Zohar as the revelations of Hasidus, of Hasidic philosophy, the depth of Torah learning as revealed by the Baal Shem Tov. And these happen at the same period of time as the Industrial Revolution is taking off. And the Rebbe interprets this Zohar as referring to these periods of the Baal Shem Tov and the Industrial Revolution and all the advances of science and technology that come as a result of that in the decades and eventually centuries since then. Now, what's unique here is how the Zohar links these two realms of wisdom, and doesn't just link them, but explains that they're a necessity precursor to this godly revelation. And what the Rebbe sees in this is that the secular realm of wisdom that's being revealed is also a godly revelation. And this includes all of the things that we're utilizing today, all of these technologies that we're talking about. And the Rebbe looks at this in a number of ways, including it as an example for godliness, as a way of teaching us and understanding what godliness means in the world around us. And there are two ways of looking at this. One of them is, we've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence, and there's the idea that we could link people all around the world instantaneously, and everything that we're doing today is tracked. Everything's documented. And when we're walking down the street in a public area, it could be filmed, and that could be entered into a database where a computer, where artificial intelligence is tracking that. They might be looking, it may be your smartwatch that's tracking your sleep patterns or your heart rate. It could be used for positive things or negative things. But this idea of a godly eye or ear that's always listening and is all seeing at all places, at all times, is something that perhaps we could understand today in a way that prior generations had no realm of understanding. And we're able to understand at least this example of what godliness means in the world. And another example is the Rebbe actually brought this from radio waves, where radio waves travel all around the world. They're all around us. And all of us on this panel or wherever you're watching this are probably sitting in a room with Wi-Fi on, and you may not be able to audibly hear those radio waves or discern the video without a receiver, without a computer screen. But those waves are there and they're all over the world. And that's a reality, a godly reality that exists as well. And technology really helps us understand that. And then there's the idea of the oneness, the unity of God that exists everywhere. And that's something that we understand from science, where science looked at elements as unique individual elements, and through physics and theory of relativity, we're able to break them down into mass and energy and really turn them into singular elements to understand everything, to understand a whole bunch of seemingly disconnected ideas. And while with godliness, it comes down to unity, it comes down to one thing, but this helps us really, technology and science and the advancement of science really helps us understand the godliness in the world around us in a way that we never, as human beings, have never been able to understand prior. And the way the Rebbe learns the Zohar, this is something that, and Kabbalah, this is something that's also a precursor to this age of awareness and knowledge of Mashiach. Now, this embrace of technology for a higher purpose is something that was utilized from the early years of the Rebbe's leadership. In fact, Professor Katz mentioned Chabad.org, and we're going to get to that in a moment, but we're talking in 1960, in the first decade of the Rebbe's leadership. And you could see this actually happening earlier, before the Rebbe becomes Rebbe, where he organized a film crew to film the previous Rebbe in color video in the 1940s. And that was a complicated endeavor at the time, and cutting edge technology for that time as well, for civilian use, just to be utilized in that way. But in 1960, a chassid by the name of Rabbi Yosef Weinberg, was a Chabad activist, began a radio show that lasted for 20 years, a weekly radio show on New York's WEVD Yiddish radio program, and would teach Tanya on there. And this was controversial, believe it or not. It was radio, but radio was seen as something that wasn't compatible with Judaism or with anything holy, really. But this show went on for 20 years. Eventually, it became a series of books in Hebrew, and then in English, Yurim B'Sefer HaTanya, and lessons in Tanya. And the Rebbe encouraged Rabbi Weinberg to do this, and encouraged this very strongly. Eventually, those efforts led to other efforts, which records were something that were seen also at the time as, remember, this is what's communicating pop culture in that period. And Lubavitch Chassidim began recording the Chabad melodies, Hasidic melodies, on these records, and a whole album was created. And those, there's some fabulous stories from the studio as the producers tried getting the Chassidim to settle down, and apparently a Farbrengen begun in the studio, complete with l'chaims. And today you could feel some of that energy in these records that are now on CD, and they're actually on the internet as well on Chabad.org. But that led, eventually, that was in the 1960s. In 1970, when the Rebbe would talk, there would be chassidim that were around the world, yeshiva students that weren't as lucky as the ones in New York to be in New York to hear the Rebbe talk. They were in places like London or Israel or South Africa in yeshiva. And one of these students asked their friend if they could splice the wire from the speaker system when the Rebbe was speaking to thousands of chassidim and really speaking to the world. But if they could splice that wire on the weekday talks and connect that to a phone line, and then call them in the yeshiva in London, and they would hook the phone line in the yeshiva in London to a speaker system in the yeshiva there. And this began an effort that, you know, when you hear about hackers, you're thinking black hat hackers, and these were black hat hackers, but a different type. And they were using these technologies for a good purpose. And what happened after that is fascinating, because this ad hoc broadcast system really pushed the technologies of the time to the max. And while we could do all of this with our phones today, and we could broadcast all over the world, they were broadcasting to London. And from London, they would connect to, that was a center connecting all over Europe. Then they had a line going to Israel. That was a center for cities and towns all over Europe, all over Israel. They were going through South America. They had 420 locations. Some of them going through these relay centers in countries all around the world. At one point, the Rebbe wanted this technology to be interactive, because it was really just broadcasting, it was going in one direction. At this point in the 1970s, interactive technologies it was basically a phone line. But what they did was they hooked up the Israeli Fabrengen, and they were able to hear the Chassidim in Israel say L'chaim to the Rebbe in 770. And eventually they started singing, and apparently there was feedback, and it didn't go well from there. But the broadcast continued and grew. In 1978, they began broadcasting faxes. When fax machines we were able to send things after a Fabrengen, after a Hasidic gathering at the end of Shabbos, when the transcripts were created of the Rebbe's talks, they would be sent to countries all around the world. And then in 1980, the Rebbe's talks began broadcasting on cable television. And if we're talking about this challenge of technology and Torah and these two realms that may seem competing, this is a point where you really start understanding that challenge. When you start seeing the Rebbe's face on television sets in people's homes all across America, and it impacted people from all walks of life. From a retired basketball coach, I think from the Harlem Globetrotters, who actually became a coach. He came to 770 and told the Rebbe, I'm a coach. And the Rebbe said, good, I need a coach. And he eventually became, there are these wonderful videos where you see him sort of encouraging the crowd at Fabrengens in 770 to, and these broadcasts impacted people like that, to the founder of Shakespeare in the Park, Joseph Papp, and others. And it really changed people's lives. In 1988, a chassid by the name of Rabbi Yosef Kazin, he was known as YY, he got a computer for his accounting work. And he discovered something called the Bulletin Board System, BBS. And BBS was these early forms of the internet where people could communicate with one another. They were bulletin boards. And he began communicating with Jews all around the world. And this is the early phase of Chabad.org. This is when Chabad.org starts coming into existence. This is before the web is a thing. He was one woman in particular told him that she couldn't, that missionaries were coming to her and she had nothing to answer them with and couldn't access Jewish texts because she was allergic to ink. And he began communicating with her, and this was a problem that that technology was able to solve for her, and gave her Jewish texts and helped her with her problem and so many other people in these early days of the internet, and really uplifting what was to be the internet that we know today. But a year later, in 1989, during Chanukah, the Rebbe began using satellite technology to really do what we were discussing a few moments before, connecting the world in this interactive way where people could see each other on one side of the world and communicate with other people from the other side of the world. And there's these satellite events were done on Chanukah, and they were done with the Rebbe. The Rebbe spoke at 3 of them, and they broadcast from 22,000 people at the foot of the Eiffel Tower in Paris to 7,000 people who packed the Kremlin's Palace of Congress in Moscow weeks before the Soviet Union is dissolved, and was broadcast on 70 television stations across the United States, or public television stations across the United States and in countries around the world. I'm going to, if I could share my screen here, I'm going to try, I'm going to play a video from 2 minutes of one of the Chanukah lives, where you really see you see the interaction of the Rebbe with the crowd. And
we will call upon Alta Perla Bruchstadt of Beth Rivka Schools in Brooklyn, who will lead us in the pasuk Torah Tziva.
Torah.
Torah.
Tziva.
Tziva.
Lanu.
Lanu.
Moshe. Elenu. Adonai. Gracious. Torah. Elenu. Bom. Beshiftecho. Belesecha. Ha'atam.
Adam.
Hatachlis.
V'tachlis.
Riyasa.
Who art in the world.
one slide in there where you see the Rebbe interacting with young people in Paris as they're dancing and they're singing with the menorah there with this Jewish pride, and they're waving to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is waving to them in real time. And this was the technology that the Rebbe is talking about in terms of unifying the world in this way, that we don't just, and the Rebbe that evening spoke about this, that it's not just an example of being able to impact the world all around us, but it's a moment where we're able to do positive things. We're able to do a mitzvah from across the world and impact. We could wire money to the other side of the world and give charity somewhere in a way that we weren't able to do before, and we're able to interact with people. We're able to learn with people and learn Torah as we are tonight on this, through this conference, on this broadcast. Now, in 1973, this is in the early days of the web, and the website Chabad.org was registered. Now, this is one of the first 500 websites. And we think of the millions of websites that exist today, or hundreds of thousands of them. This is one of the first 500 websites. And if we're talking in internet years, this is prehistoric. And this is before AOL existed. This is before Google.com existed, before Yahoo. This is even before nytimes.com was registered. And the idea was really utilizing these technologies for a higher purpose and using these revelations in a positive way. Now, Chabad.org is also the platform of thousands of websites that Chabad emissaries or Chabad communities all around the world utilize on this platform. And they serve 54 million unique visitors every year. That's an enormous amount of people from all around the world. At one point, I was endeavoring to make an infographic to sort of illustrate the impact that Chabad.org has. And what I found was I tried creating a map of the world in blue and red to see which countries had a visitor the year before and which ones didn't. And there was one country that was discernible from space where we didn't have a visitor, and it wasn't in the Gulf or in North Korea. It was Western Sahara, actually. But the website has more than 100,000 pages of content of Torah, 15,000 videos. Some of those could be children's programs. And we have editors in different languages, in 8 languages, in fact. And if we're talking about making these godly ideas accessible to everybody, I don't think there's a better example. In fact, you could say that in some ways, Chabad.org is the largest Torah learning project since the Talmud, or perhaps the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. 54 million unique people learning and studying in English, in Hebrew, in Spanish, in French, in Russian, and Portuguese, Italian, and German. Those are just the platforms that we have editors in. There's content and many more. A few years ago, we actually endeavored to launch a project that would make some of the content or some content about Judaism and about Jews accessible to 90% of the world, meaning that it's in Urdu, it's in Chinese, it's in Arabic. And we've ensured that language is not a barrier. And geography certainly isn't when you think about that world map. And really background also isn't. And if you think about that story with Rabbi Gordon and that truck driver who may be helping with the supply chain issues that we're having now while he's listening to Torah being taught, whether it's Hasidus or some Maimonides of the day. And what we've also done is taken this off of the platform, off of the website itself, and it's on all kinds of platforms as well, like on apps. And in really, you could carry this content, you could carry this Torah around with you in your pocket. Another example actually of, and this goes to something that Dr. Lightstone mentioned the other day. And Dr. Lightstone mentioned how there's so much garbage, I think was his quote, on Amazon, and people publish these books, and they're able to print on demand on Amazon, and their book is available everywhere in the world. Now, I'll give you the flip side of that. When the pandemic hit and lockdown started, at Chabad.org, we started trying to imagine, what are people going through? What are the challenges that people have? How can we help them in their current situations in real time? So if I believe the first lockdowns began in mid-March in New York, or the lockdowns in New York began in mid-March. And that Shabbos, before Shabbos, we had a program devised on how to help people celebrate Shabbos at home. And the entire endeavor of what we tried doing throughout the pandemic was helping people get through this time, right? And give them the tools not only to observe Judaism and make that meaningful for themselves, but also to bring hope and happiness and joy into their lives through whatever endeavors, through whatever channels we could. And one of the things that we realized was that Pesach is actually, the Seder is the most observed ritual for American Jews. And it's not done in a synagogue, it's done in people's homes, and families come together. But this was going to be the first Pesach, the first Passover, that people couldn't celebrate with their families. What that meant was that there were going to be more Seders, more individual Seders than ever in history. And what we did was we set out to create a Haggadah that would help every person be the Moses of their Seder. And you had to have no experience, you didn't have to have any experience. You wouldn't have to have the matriarch of the family guiding everyone. And we created a Haggadah. And the thing about this Haggadah was that we distributed it for free. You could download it and print it at home from Chabad.org, or you could print on demand from Amazon. Now, this Haggadah was available instantly, or not instantly, it would take about a day to arrive, from all these print locations that Amazon had in Europe or on other continents and across the United States. So there are ways where we're able to utilize some of these things that may have a lot of garbage on them. But it's not just something that we have the ability to impact for a higher purpose, but we have an obligation. And when we know and we understand that these are really godly revelations, that empowers us and helps us use it for the good. And with that in mind, I'm just going to remind everyone that just taking part in this conference and being here and watching this at home means that you're participating in this as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Seligson. Quite remarkable talk. We know that Chabad.org is in the forefront, and you told us it's even more than we thought so. The Rebbe's unique take on using the materials of this world for the purposes of the higher, and to see the two are not really separate. It's a wonderful philosophy, but it's even more wonderful to me to see how you put it into effect. Philosophy is one thing, action based on philosophy is something else. One other little point before we move on, I just want to say, the internet is so useful for people to learn about Judaism. Of course it is. One thing I know about are what we used to call lost tribes. Sometimes we still do, and we call emerging Jewish communities. And these are groups literally everywhere in the world, all across Africa, Asia, many in South America. They're everywhere. They're people who, for however they come to this understanding of their identity, they're somehow Jews. And so they want to actualize their identity. They want to live as Jews now. So what do? There's 10 families somewhere in Uganda. There's 30 families somewhere in one of the states of India. There's some people in Papua New Guinea. So not only do they learn Yiddishkeit from Chabad.org primarily, and other wonderful websites too. But even more interesting to me is that they connect with one another on the internet to reinforce each other's commitment. And you will see minyanim that may be based in Uganda, but is also people in Andhra Pradesh or in Papua New Guinea or in remote Peru at the same moment putting on the tefillin and davening virtually together. So there are a lot of people there. This is one of my things I try to convey. Tens of millions of people, more people probably than there are Jews, who identify with Judaism and want to take some steps towards learning or even becoming Jewish. This portends remarkable things for our people, and you play a major role in that too. Thank you. Okay, now our last presentation for this evening is from Dr. Menachem Feuer, who has been with us before. He is the co-founder of Adeleg IT. And what this is, it's a company dedicated to training and educating members of the Jewish community everywhere in the United States, Canada, Brazil, etc., in all sorts of things I don't understand: full stack development, Python programming. In Florida, Python programming means something else. It means tell the Pythons, go away, I'm programming. Data science, machine learning, and AWS cloud computing. I don't know what those things are, but I'm sure they're very useful, and I'm sure there are ways that people, and here's the point, can earn an honest, honorable living, yet remain in a comfortable position vis-a-vis the secular world. Those of us in the Jewish community, especially the Orthodox community, are very aware that we have many young people who have no marketable skills, and it creates problems in America and all the more in Israel. So what Dr. Feuer is doing is commendable many times over. So kol hakavod. He runs programs in Jewish schools in the United States and Canada, and is a major force, he is, in promoting digital literacy in the Jewish community. Aside from being an entrepreneur in IT training, he is a member of the Jewish Studies faculty at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He was previously a member of the Center for Jewish Studies at York University in Canada. He has written many articles, active in the academic life, and just sort of incidentally, he has a blog called the Shlemiel Theory blog. And it's based on, it starts with the work of one of our dear friends who's been with us, Dr. Ruth Wise, who started to talk about the Shlemiel figure in Jewish literature. And Menachem has taken that and done remarkably creative, provocative things in analyzing literature and culture through the eyes of the Shlemiel, sort of. Anyway, despite my mangling, Menachem, what you really do, let me call on you to please tell us about this very important work you're doing. My brothers and sisters, please meet Dr. Menachem Feuer.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I am an academic, and I also am running this IT company, and I'm happy to say we're in Jewish schools in the United States and Canada. We're in Chicago, we're in New York, we're in New Jersey, we're in Toronto, and we're nearly educating up to 900, we're up to like around 900 kids right now. We're teaching coding every day during the day. So my thing is, what I love about what I do is I'm not just an academic talking about things. I'm doing things in the sense that I feel like I'm a part of cultural change, and I'm going to encourage everybody to get involved. And I see like Sam Lightstone has talked for us, for instance. He's a part of this conference. Several really great people from Shopify, Microsoft, Google have been a part of our initiatives, men and women. I have a lot of great things to announce as well. You know, towards the end of the talk, I'll talk about that as well. But this is, so my talk today, I'll be talking about something. I was a professor for 13 years. I still am on the faculty of University of Waterloo, Jewish Studies. And one of my focuses is on philosophy and in Jewish studies, literature. That's my Shlemiel blog. It's like one of my now kind of like a hobby interest, but it's more than that because I'm a scholar in this. So I do tech and comedy, philosophically. And it's really interesting because this conference, I was planning on going to Miami and then flying from Miami to Budapest, because in Budapest, I'm giving a graduate seminar on the Shlemiel character. So I'm getting to do everything over the next few weeks. I'm going to be giving a graduate seminar over there for 2 weeks. And then I'm coming back to, I'm based in Toronto, but I'll be coming back here after that. So I'm very excited to present today, and I'm going to go share my screen right now. And I'm hoping this everything works out with all the tech going, all my screens on my end over here. Okay, so the title of my talk is Judaism in a Digital World: The Philosophical, Mystical, and Practical Approaches to the Future of Tech in the Jewish Community. I know it's a broad title, and I'm only going to touch on some of it today. And I hope that I enlighten you and the people that are listening all around the world right now. And I'm very honored to be with the head of Chabad.org right now. You're incredible. You're like one of the websites that I cite in my talk, and you do incredible work. Okay, so one of the things I want to do is I'm really into perspective change. Is we need to look at things differently. We need to look at our Torah, like technology in our Torah differently. And one of the main words that I'm going to be focused on is a Greek word. We use it all the time, technology. It's from the word techne, which is a Greek word. And we use it all the time, so it's built into our language. And we need to understand what that is. We also understand, Judaism came before the Greeks, came before Plato and Aristotle, and all these thinkers are going, like Heidegger will be talking, Martin Heidegger will talking about tonight, about how he went back. And just I want to rethink things a little bit, give some perspective. Like, for instance, if you look like Rabbi Soloveitchik, we're going to be talking about today, talks about the two atoms I'll be talking about. And if you think about it, Adam is commanded to master nature, all beasts in the field. And really, technology makes that possible. And we could do that in a much more efficient way. And so much of our world is administered and automated through technology. So think of us today as that extension of that, and to such a great extent. Another, Noah is a farmer. He's an agricultural innovator. Yaakov dabbled in genetic engineering, as we see in a parsha just not recently from now. So we just went through. And if you look at it, the Urim and Tumim was a kind of technology, just like the Mishkan and the temple. They're all these, if you could see, they're all conduits of holiness, and they're all bringing holiness. Okay, so if you also think about something that's been talked about a lot, is like the golem. The golem is a kind of technology. He's a robot of sorts, a programmed. It's like it does things, but it has no language capacity, no speech capacity, but it follows orders, just like an Alexa or a Google or what have you, or the machine learning technologies. And if you think about it, the golem is a military defense technology. And if you think, and also the other thing to think about is like in the Zohar, the Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Yetzirah was the first to come up with this idea that everything in the world is built out of Hebrew letters. It's built out of code, so to speak. And also the Shari Yichud V'Amunah, and all things are made of code, and you could build with code. The Sefer Yetzirah uses this language that you could build with the Hebrew language. And in fact, that Hashem has built the entire world. Every single thing in the universe, virtual and unvirtual, all worlds are created by God's language and by God's words. So this is, so to speak, this is, our whole world is coded. So this should be, as I say, technology is built into Judaism. This shouldn't seem, foreign to us. Technology is a part of us. And also we saw recently as well, like with Yosef, and with how he dealt with the crisis of the famine. All of these things are not just logic, but they also deal with technologies. So let's go take a look at the world that we're living in right now before we can come back and understand different philosophical and mystical and practical perspectives on technology. So right now we have cloud, big data, and AI right now are creating this revolution that we're seeing around us right now with all these streaming services, whether it's Spotify or Netflix. All these things run on cloud and big data, and in all these self-driving cars. All these things are going on because now we have a capacity, and like Sam Lightstone gave a great lecture for us, and he's done here as well, about, and knows very intimately how this is happening. And it's just growing exponentially. The more users come on, the more data is available. And it's actually very interesting because before I came on tonight, I was listening to the show on CNBC, and they were talking, these European tech people were talking about how much power it takes to power up these data centers, the cloud, that are all over the place. Like Amazon, like when Amazon Web Services, we're an AWS Academy ourselves. We do AWS. We teach AWS to our students in the United States, Canada, and Brazil. And one of the interesting things about AWS is when they back up your data, they put it in a few different places. So they have all these huge data centers going on. All this energy is being driven. All of the stuff that we're doing is being driven by this data, and it's increasing. And they're increasing their centers, and they have to increase their security. And this is a major part of our lives, so we can talk to each other in simultaneity. Think about Zoom right now. Zoom is working on big data. It's working on cloud in a major rate, and there are more and more people subscribing. And in fact, Adele IT, I've been communicating with Zoom, and they just came up with this new feature. Believe it or not, I'm surprised it took them this long. Like we have, because I'm running classes in several different schools in the United States and Canada, I have all these different Zoom accounts, right? So what we had to do is we had to consolidate them. So I've been communicating with Zoom for a while. I'm like, how can I do with these accounts? And just keep on adding accounts. And just recently, they're like, no, you can consolidate all those accounts, and you could have different users, and now they can go to different places. And all this has to do with cloud. Another thing that you really keep in mind how crazy this is that 4.6 billion people are online right now. 60% of the planet is online as we speak. And the majority of those people are on mobile devices. 93% of access to the internet is not through desktop computers or laptops, it's through mobile devices. The smartphones that we have in our hands are so incredibly powerful. The other thing is, just to give you some statistics, and I'm going to talk about the next generation, and something Sam could talk about being a member of Meta, for you formerly Facebook, is there are 2.9 billion users on Facebook. There are 1 billion users on Instagram and 290 million users on Twitter. And there are 1.5 billion users on Gmail. Just to think of another thing to keep in mind is I'm using the word user. These are people, but user is the term that's used, that is used by a lot of tech companies to understand all these data points. These are different users that are using their services. So now let's talk about just the next generation. And I'm bringing this up now because I'm talking about Judaism, future Judaism in tech, in the world, in the digital world. And to better understand this, you have to understand, where are the kids? Where is the future generation? I have children right now, and they're very adapted social media. Kids that we teach in schools, you'd be blown away by like a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old. How what's the word that's used to describe them is that they're native. When I grew up, I had like a Commodore 64. I had a computer. I was really into it, but I wasn't like the way these kids were. I was not constantly online. So just to give you an idea of all the users, all the kids that are on. So 1.5 billion users are on TikTok. We have 1.2 billion users on something called WeChat. And WeChat is in China. And this is, China's a huge country. But if you look at these numbers, it's also the Pacific Rim, which is included in WeChat. But this is something we don't have here. I heard from someone who works in the National Bank in Toronto, who's really adept at what's going on with banking services and whatnot. And he told me something really fascinating, that WeChat, it's not only that they have all these users, but they do everything on it. They do their banking on it. They do it. So imagine like Facebook or some other platforms, Twitter, having all of your services on one platform. And this is how powerful it is. And it's coming. It's going to come to North America. We don't see it right now. We have some services that are, let's say, on Facebook, but those services are likely what these platforms want to do is to increase the number of services that they offer. And that means that we're going to be doing more stuff on this or that platform. And WeChat is owned by this company called Tenchat. They also own TikTok. They're a Chinese company. They're humongous. They're very powerful, and they have a lot of influence. And it's very interesting. I heard now in China, they're having some trouble, a little bit of tension going between them and the government. But they are one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. You may not have heard of it before. You've heard of Google, you've heard of Facebook, Twitter, etc. But you may not have heard of Tencent. Go check them out. Right now, there are 360 million users on Snapchat. These are all kids. Most of them are kids. 41.5 million gamers are on Twitch. And I want to note here, this is growing all the time, ever exponentially. Like I know someone who's the CEO and also CEIO of a company called Enthusiast Gaming. This, just to tell you a really brief story, just how interesting this is. The guy who founded Enthusiast Gaming was a Froome guy, and he liked playing video games. I think it was Nintendo. And he got a group of people playing Nintendo together, like a group, and they would compete with each other playing Nintendo. And then turned into like a larger thing in different gaming over the years, different types of gaming platforms. And now it's one of the biggest gaming competitions. And what they did was they turned that into a gaming platform. So you have I think he has like 50 million people a month come into his website to check out this gaming, and all these different companies are merging with them. So our kids are on the gaming platforms, and I'm willing to bet right now 1 out of every 5 kids at least is on gaming platforms, a lot like Twitch. And they're also, if you look at the numbers, there are 2.69 billion gamers in the world. It's crazy, and it's only going to get bigger. Kids really love gaming, and Twitch is where they can be on gaming and show themselves on gaming while they're gaming. It's a very interesting medium. The other interesting thing I just want to mention is Meta, with what Mark Zuckerberg wants to do, and what Sam could tell you more about it, and I'm sure, is that VR and AR, virtual reality and augmented reality, are growing, and they're only going to grow more. And we should be concerned with that as a community about getting on these mediums. I know the Rebbe wanted to be in places where people are. So these are going to be the places where people are. They're going to be in there. And we have to think about how do you bring Judaism in these spaces? And the other thing to keep in mind is, like I'm sitting right next to my Alexa. I don't want to say it because it's going to ask me for what do you want, etc. But I have my Alexas and my rooms. They're all around us. We have Google Home, Google Nest. All these things are in our homes now. A lot of us have this, and they're going to increase. Another thing is, Elon Musk just recently announced the Tesla bot that's going to be coming on next year. He's going to have a prototype. So he's already thinking about people having robots in their houses doing activities for them, doing the laundry, taking out the garbage, all types of household activities that we have right now. He's already thinking about this. I'm just like giving you like a little taste of what's to come and where Judaism is going to have to go and deal with. Okay, so I'm going to go talk about some Greek points of view. Start off because the Greeks came up with this idea of technology. There's maybe some stuff you've heard or you may not have heard before, but there are 2 foundational views on technology I'm going to talk about today, just briefly Greek views. One comes from Plato and the other one comes from Aristotle. So first of all, Plato did not have a positive, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is not just because the word technology and the word techne that we use comes from the Greeks, but I also would argue that a lot of Jewish philosophy, a lot of Jewish mysticism, and I'm not the only person, you could look up Elliot Wolfson, who's a great scholar of Kabbalah and Hasidus, and he wrote a great book on the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Open Secret, one of the best books out there on the Rebbe, and he's a great intellectual. And one of the things that he points out, and a lot of other scholars point out, is that a lot of Hasidus does have what's called Neoplatonic views and Aristotelian views built into it. A lot of, if you look at the Tanya, if I were to, if you're a scholar of the Platonic or the Aristotelian, you could see a lot of that stuff in there. And a lot of the things that we find in Tanya, take from this or they take from there. So it's important to know what these views are. So we could also, understand in Hasidus what it took from there. and what it didn't take from there. So Plato does not have a positive reading on technology. And one of the reasons he said this is because he believed that technology got in the way of organic memory and orality. And he believed, like, basically writing, he argued, is a crutch. And it's like writing is a technology for him. He sees it as in this, what's called the myth of Thoth. The myth of Thoth is this myth that he brings up in this famous dialogue called the Phaedrus. And in that dialogue, he talks to Phaedrus as a young man who is very interested in the sophists, and he wants to become a sophist. As he's interested in this dialogue about love and about friendship. You know, what's the meaning of friendship? Who's a real friend? So Socrates tells him, he said, look, you're carrying around a speech. You can't even remember the speech by yourself. You're not using your own mind. You're not using your brain. You're going to use your mind. So Socrates said to him that Thoth was this Egyptian god, and this Egyptian god gave to humankind, he gave them chess, he gave them writing, he gave them these technologies. And this is what Socrates says in the dialogue. He says, if men learn this, if men learn writing, we're just talking about writing, this isn't an oral culture. He says, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they will rely on what is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. So that for Plato is a very negative thing. You shouldn't have to rely on writing. You should use organic memory. You should not. I actually had a student in university who is, everybody's taking notes when I'd lecture, but this guy would sit right in the front and he never took one note. And I asked him, I said, why aren't you taking notes? He said, well, it's all organic. It has to come from yourself. Otherwise, you're not using your memory. You're not using what God gave you, which is a very Platonic view of the soul. So in the famous essay by Jacques Derrida is the founder of deconstruction. It's called Plato's Pharmacy, and he points out there that Socrates was afraid of writing because of the polyvalence of meaning. And this is very interesting because if you look at the Talmud, when it was written down, even that there was a whole controversy of committing the oral tradition to writing. Maimonides talks about this. It's like there's a major crisis. And he says the Mishnah Torah is also a crisis, it's responding to a crisis. And it has to be committed to writing for people to remember it. But Derrida goes on, he points out that Socrates was afraid of writing because you can't stand behind writing. Like when you write an essay, when it's out there, anybody can interpret your words, just like on Facebook or text. People are always misinterpreting things all the time, interpreting them to mean things that they don't say. So this is what he says. That's what he says about writing. And he says that it's unstable and it's unreliable. And he says that writing is like a ruse. Technology is a ruse. It's like it's not trustworthy. So Plato would have anything outside of the human person, outside of that aids them is not good for a human being. It's not helping them to bring things in their potential to actuality. So the word that's used in Greek to talk about imitation, which is a big thing for Plato and is a big part of his understanding of technology, is mimesis. If you look at the word mimesis, what's in the word mimesis is the word mime, right? Is that it's imitating, it's miming things. And the problem he had with art, with poetry, with writing, is that he said it would mime things that we see around us. So it's just like illusions, like in his famous cave allegory. It just amplifies the senses, and that for Plato is not good. It's just a sensory amplification. It's not good for the soul. So what did Plato come up with? What is the solution Socrates comes up with, and we find in Plato's dialogues? It's something called anamnesis. Anamnesis. So you think of anamnesis, it sounds like amnesia, but actually anamnesis has neme in it, it's memory. Anamnesis is what's called recollection. And this is a very interesting Platonic idea, which I think influenced a lot of Kabbalah, no question about it, is that, and we also see it in Gemara Nida, it says in the Talmud in Nida, before a child is born, they know the entire Torah, right? And then they have the cleft right here that they get knocked, and then they forget everything. And that means that before they were born, they knew all the Torah, right? So Plato's had this idea that we knew everything before we came into the physical world, right? And then we forgot it. right? And now our task is, in philosophers, for Plato and the famous dialogue, the Phaedo, is to remember what we've forgotten, to recollect it. And the only way to do that is not through writing, it's through memory, it's through philosophy, it's through the dialectic. One of the things that Plato used to prove it in the famous dialogue called the Meno was that math, and also in the Phaedo, he used the concept of equality, like, or a circle or a square. Like, where in existence can you find a perfect circle or square? There is no circle or square in existence. It's a mental thing. It's a thing that only your mind can access, right? So Plato believed that that in his famous dialogue, the Meno, Socrates has a slave, and he proves the existence of something prior to physical existence through a slave at that time who was not educated like the other Greeks, and he showed that this slave knows how to do math. Where do you get this capacity from? So he said it must come from something which is prior to materiality, which is something spiritual, which is accessible to every single person. So for Plato, the thing that's accessible to everybody, it's not like, it's very interesting that Google's like technology makes everything accessible, but for Plato, accessible means accessible to math, the things that are prior to physical existence that the mind can access. The things that the senses can access is not good. So he had a problem with technology, and all of this is rooted in his thinking about the soul and thinking about math, and believe it or not. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit, a second here. Let's talk a little bit about Aristotle and computer science. Aristotle is always known to have a different perspective from Plato when it comes to a lot of things, especially like the forms. Aristotle is very into the meaning of experience and more of a process-oriented type of philosophy. So Aristotle had a different view of technology. So Aristotle believed that technology, or techne, is a type of like means making. We're going to talk about Martin Heidegger in a second, is that technology or techne helps things to fulfill their nature. Like, think about it. For Aristotle, just to give you an idea, he said every single thing in Greek, the word has an ergon or telos. It means that's every single thing has a nature towards which it is directed. Trees need to grow and to bear fruit. Dogs need to run around, have fun, and be happy. Whatever. Every animal, every plant, everything in the world has an ergon that it has to live to, including human beings, which we'll talk about in a second. So irrigation is good. It's a good technology because it could help trees to grow. Better agriculture, water treatment plants, improved housing and power. All these things can help us to live a better life. And then for Aristotle, it's really good, especially for humans, because if you have all these good things that make you healthy and good, then you can think. You can think more, you can philosophize. Philosophy is thought, thinking, thought. And according to Aristotle, no one can think unless the necessities of life are taken care of. And this is kind of like Rick Rambam's perspective, is like, when you get to, the messianic times, you'll have free time to think all the time. All you have is time to think. And like maybe this era that we're in, Aristotle would say, this is great. Like, if you get to a place where you can think on your own, and you have all these things taken care of, it's great. It's great for all existence. Technology is great for everything, for Aristotle. Completely different perspective from Plato. Also, if you look at the founders of computer science or set theory and logic, it's interesting. My father I always used to hear about this when I was a kid. I used to hear about Boolean logic and stuff. I remember when I was a kid, because my father he was a NASA fellow, and he was a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He was at Columbia University, and he went to Brooklyn Tech. And through his whole thing, he's gotten to engineering and into computer science. And he's very into, so I used to hear Boolean logic all the time in my house. So one of the interesting things, there's a really interesting idea that they had is that they believe that technology, that all of them believe that computer science, the idea of computer science, especially it was George Boole, who said that it all starts with Aristotle. One second here, I just want to get a quote here on that for you. Bear with me. Okay. Yeah, George Boole said, in its ancient and scholastic form, indeed, the subject of logic stands almost exclusively associated with the great name of Aristotle. And this is one of the major founders of the logic that goes in computer science. As it was presented to ancient Greece in the partly technical, partly metaphysical disquisitions of the Organon, which is one of Aristotle's lectures. Such, with scarcely any essential change, it has continued to the present day. So for the founder of computer science, Aristotle, not Plato, is what we see leading to what we have with this technology and our attitude towards technology and the computers that we have in what we're using today. So he believed that technology can help us to understand nature, reality, logic parallels, parries natural processes and machines, like we've heard before earlier in the conference. It's I think it was Rabbi Lipskar had mentioned about how there's this mechanisms that are going on. This is true. These are machines. And that there's like I teach, one of the programs we run is data science and machine learning. It's called machine learning for a reason. You teach it how to understand things and how to learn on its own. So one of the things he said, that machines may be able to think better than humans, very controversial statement that he had made. And machines don't make the same mistakes humans make and are much more systematic. And it's true. A lot of our machines are running our phones, they're doing all these things for us, because if we would, the automation, it's built into automation. If the only way they can make mistakes if we program them improperly, then the mistakes they made are just bad programming. So now I want to move on to Martin Heidegger, a very controversial figure, especially because he had for a time period joined the Nazi Party. There's a very controversial person. However, I'm bringing him up here because he's regarded by just about every philosopher today who has, or any, in academia, is the #1 philosopher in the 20th century. Be that as it may, his crazy taking part in Hitler's regime. It's been very important to understand him, and then we're going to critique him. Emanuel Levinas, who's a Lithuanian Jew, we're going to go, a major philosopher, critiqued his work and the basis of ethics, and we'll explain why this is so incredibly relevant. So you have to know who he's critiquing. So let's understand Heidegger. So Heidegger believed that, Heidegger wanted to go back to the Greeks. He thinks that Plato and Aristotle screwed up. They didn't really understand what he called the question of being. And he said that we have to recover that question, which he said has been forgotten. It's interesting because Plato said there's a forgetfulness of being, so we have to remember. So Heidegger takes this idea and he says, no, there's a forgetfulness of being, but not the way Plato understood what being was. We have to rethink it if we're going to, if philosophy and humanity are to live better, to fulfill their, as he calls, their destiny. So one of the things, he had a major discourse on technology. Heidegger, mind you, was, his view of technology reflects, in a lot of ways, kind of like a romantic German view, like an ecological view, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the things he said about technology is that he came up with this word to say, technology looks at the world as what's called Gestell. Gestell means standing reserve. In other words, everything in reality is a resource, whether it's human beings or animals or nature, whatever it is, it's standing reserve. It's a resource that is to be used. And one of the things Heidegger says is very interesting. He says that the word techne actually means revelation or disclosure. It's revealing something. So it's revealing nature. For Heidegger, it's revealing the earth as a resource. And if that for him is not good, it's a challenge. So he says that believe technology, sounding like kind of like Plato, but coming from a different angle now, is a threat to reality. And he says the possibility of what he calls being in the world, which we'll explain in a second. So one of the contrasts that he made is that he says that techne is different from poesis. And if you look at the word poesis, it sounds like poetry, and that's correct. So Heidegger believed that poesis is a way of speaking and of saying and of language, because Heidegger was very into language, is that human beings live in language. They live in what he called the house of language. And that's one way of disclosing the world is through language. And a lot of people like Jacques Lacan, other people Jacques Lacan is a famous psychoanalyst who carried on after Freud, and his writings are very popular. They're read in universities and have been for many years. And one of the things that Heidegger and Lacan says that the unconscious is a language. So if you understand that language, you can better understand humanity, what it means to be human. And he says that techne gets in the way of a poetic kind of poesis way of revealing the world. And it's a challenge to that. And that humans should be living in a poesis kind of way. And that basically, think of it this way, is that techne, that way of disclosure, should be serving poesis rather than the other way around, which is, and if you look at the world today, I mean, if you're a Heideggerian, you look at the world today, it's just, it's a disaster because, you know, technology is running the world and the disclosure is that way. So he wanted to challenge that back in the 1930s when he came up with these ideas all the way up to the 50s after the Holocaust. So he says, one of the things that Heidegger says is interesting. He says the only way to find, he calls salvation. He believes that technology puts us in a mode of danger that we need to be saved from. And he says that by bringing in techne and poesis into a contrast, a kind of conflict with each other, we become what he calls questioning beings. We start questioning, what am I really doing with technology? What is this world? Maybe it's like there's something unfulfilling, there's no meaning, like all of these types of existential questions that people have that's what he wanted to have. And he called this way of thinking, he calls it the piety of thought. And it's very interesting. He makes it, I'm gonna make a contrast right now between what's the sacred, which is what Heidegger is interested, and the holy, which is something Judaism is interested in. We're going to talk, so Levinas brings this out. We're going to see in the next slide. So Heidegger believed that the piety of thought is what is not a technological kind of thinking. The piety of thought is based in a poetical, language-based way of thinking. And you could think about it, maybe deconstruction, postmodernism, a lot of stuff we see today, which came out of Heidegger, no question about it, is more influenced in this way of thinking than what's called like Theodor Adorno, another famous Jewish German thinker, would call, using reason as everything is a means to an end. Everything is like a technology. It's like something, a conduit that you could use. Like language is something you use. He said this whole use of thinking about language and all things in terms of use is a misreading of techne. That's what Heidegger thought, and other people around him thought and were influenced by his thinking thought. Okay, so now we'll move on to another realm, which is influenced by Heidegger majorly, and his teacher, Edmund Husserl, who was a Jew, who Heidegger had to fire when Hitler came to power. It's horrible. All of this is horrible stuff that happened, prior to the Holocaust. And all these people are a part of this, including these great philosophers who became, sick people, did unethical things. So one of the things that Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, who was his student of Edmund Husserl, talked about, they founded was this idea, this new philosophical approach called phenomenology. Phenomenology is basically saying that, look, the life of the mind from, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, all the way to Descartes and Leibniz, all these people are actually Leibniz and Descartes, all these people are influential in computer science and logic. And he said, basically, Husserl and Heidegger, this idea came back, is that what's missing is the Lebenswelt, the living world. What's that? The world of experience. That's what's missing. We've been living the life of the mind. What about our senses? What about our experiences? We've totally devaluated the meaning of experience. And phenomenology is the study of experience, study of the life world that we're living in. And one of the things that this one thinker, there's an ecological thinker that came after him, and Jaspers was one of Heidegger's students, was a more ecological thinker, and Heidegger, in a lot of ways, is an ecological thinker. It's one of the interesting things, by the way, when Adolf Hitler came to power, one of the things he did was he put out a decree saying, to preserve nature. Nature is greater than humans. The earth is greater than human. It's like this mystical anti-human force, which is greater than human beings. So Merleau-Ponty believed that technology can be used to disclose the relationship between man and what he calls the flesh, the world. But what kind of, so the person I'm citing here is David Abram. It's in his book, On the Sensuous. It's called On the Sensuous. In this book he has, The Spell of the Sensuous. And in Abram's book, he says something very interesting. He said, what technology was Merleau-Ponty talking about? So he says something very interesting. He says it's not the technology we have today that Heidegger was talking about, standing reserve. He actually talks about indigenous technology. Like, what does he mean by that? He means by like people going out, indigenous people going out and hunting. When they hunt, they're like paying attention to the sounds of the wind, and to the animals, and to the smells, all these things that make you use your senses. So if a technology doesn't draw on your senses, it's a technology that's no good. It's like unethical in his view, in their view, is that any technology that, like, basically the indigenous people for him, for Nathan Abram, so is basically they're the people we should learn about technology. So he would like look at the world today and say this is going way off. And his book starts off saying that he says, I went to India and I went to these places and I smelled things and I experienced things, but I came back to North America, I lost all of that. I lost all those senses, and it's horrible. But what he's proposing, though, is to go back to something primitive, and we can't do that, So this is just a point of view. I think it's very interesting. I think it's valuable in a lot of ways. I think it's nice to get in touch with nature and all your senses and open them up. My wife is a yoga trainer, for instance, and I think it's important to, open up to the life world and to your senses. But I don't think, the way they're looking at it is just technology is evil and destroying the environment and all these things. There is a lot to discuss about that. And Google and Microsoft and Facebook, all these companies are very interested in dealing with these questions, but it's definitely not the right direction. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, 1 second here. Okay, so coming up to challenge this is Emmanuel. Now we have a Jewish philosopher. And Nathan Abram, by the way, is Jewish too, but he's under the spell of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty to a major extent. But Emmanuel Levinas was a Lithuanian philosopher. He's from Lithuania. He was went to Paris. He was put into military camp during World War II. He was caught and he was put in a work camp, a labor camp. He survived the Holocaust. His family survived the Holocaust, thank God, except for his parents were killed. But his children, they survived. He survived. And one of the things that he came up is he realized that Martin Heidegger, since he was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, he had to challenge him. And he said Judaism has to challenge this way of thinking about technology. So he wrote this incredible essay after the Holocaust. And he said that basically we need to rethink, he came up with this idea before I get to that essay, is that we need to think, sorry about this. Okay. He came up with this idea, it's called ethics is first philosophy. Now, what's first philosophy? First philosophy is basically a founding philosophy of things, like Aristotle had his first philosophy, Descartes had his first philosophy. Rene Descartes was trying to say, I will doubt everything until I find something on which everything is founded. And the famous idea that he came up with in the Meditations on First Philosophy is that thing which everything is founded on is the mind. So first philosophy is the foundation. So for Descartes, the mind is going to be the cogito, I think, therefore I am. That's going to be the I, that was going to be the foundation for modern philosophy. That's the only thing you can be certain of. You can't doubt that you're thinking. You can't doubt that you're doubting. So basically, Heidegger has his first philosophy too. It's a philosophy of being, So Levinas comes on and he says, no, Judaism believes in ethics as first philosophy. Instead of starting with being, instead of starting with the self, you start with the other. Judaism starts with the other. Ethics is first philosophy. So he takes phenomenology and the experience of the other, and we see this throughout the Torah, the importance of the other person, the ger, the stranger, the orphan. Abraham, when God comes and visits him after circumcision, he wants to go and take care of his guests. He wants to leave the presence. It's a famous Rashi. Why? There are many sikhas that are written on this. So Levinas says this is where we need to start. Now, he argued that the big problem is Heidegger is basically bringing up a mythology, is that he wants us to be, and what he called paganism. So Heidegger's philosophy is that, as Levinas points out, is a philosophy of place, about being there. Dasein means being there, and Dasein was a very important part of Heidegger's philosophy, being there, being in the world. So Heidegger, he said, is more interested in the mystery of things, like things, letting things be, instead of using things as a resource, using them as a means to an end, let them be. And then you could see, like, you can experience them as they are. The table is the table, the tree is the tree, like even Martin Buber talks about trees, experiencing trees, listening to trees. So, but the way Levinas looks at this, if you want to let things be and get lost in the mystery of things, ethics becomes nullified. And Levinas argues that technology says that these are that the way Heidegger looks at things is that as a reactionary would look at things. Instead of affirming the progress of technology, Heidegger was reacting to that. And he said that by saying that it's posing a major threat to society and saying that, you know, this is something we have to get rid of, like Levinas says, this is all really a major problem. There must be something about technology. So he argues that technology threatens unrootedness. And this shares a lot with Judaism. Judaism is against paganism. It's against worship of trees and stuff and nature, all these types of things. And Levinas saw this as a legitimate threat, like the Nazis were obsessed with earth and blood, you know, earth and blood and all these things which are associated, which are, you know, this kind of mystical relationship with the earth. And this is something that Judaism should totally outright condemn. So this is a quote from this essay, that this essay and the book Difficult Freedom that Levinas cites, which talks about, you know, basically this first quote right here is a parody of Heidegger, so to speak. He's mimicking Heidegger's, what he says. He says, a work of art, Heidegger's one of his famous essays is The Origin of the Work of Art. What is the meaning of art? Remember, poiesis, a very important central part of Heidegger's philosophy. He says, a work of art, a blazing forth of being and not a human invention, makes his anti-human splendor grow. It's anti-human, like the artwork. And it's beautiful. I love art. We all love art. But Heidegger is making this into this kind of this mystical, the way Levinas portrays this is this mystical stuff coming out of the artwork. Myth announces itself within nature. Nature is implanted in that first language which hails us only to found human language. Man must be able to listen and reply, not to the other, but to nature. Not to the other person, but to this language coming from the earth. But to hear this language and reply to it consists not in giving oneself over to logical thoughts raised in a system of knowledge, like Boolean or all these are Aristotelian type of knowledge, what have you, but in living in the place and being there, in rootedness. And this is a German pagan idea that Nazis emulated, that they're rooted in their land. And he says that this is something that totally goes against Judaism. He says here, this then is the eternal seductiveness of paganism, beyond the infantilism of idolatry. And he says this, what he means by this is that, you know, we don't have idolatry today, but he was like saying back when he wrote this essay in the 1950s, but we do have paganism. He said, that's the sacred, not the holy. I just want to note, Levinas by the holy means the relationship to the other is a relationship to God. That's the holy. This is the sacred. He says the sacred filtering to the world. Judaism is perhaps no more than the negation of that. It's basically making a major claim about Judaism. Judaism is the negation of the sacred, negation of this paganism. To destroy the sacred groves, we understand the purity of its apparent vandalism. The mystery of things, and I love this quote, is the source of all cruelty towards men. And he believes that not just, you know, he likens in this essay, technology, the mission of technology and Judaism are the same in that sense, is to challenge paganism. Now I'm going to talk briefly about Yosef Soloveitchik's take on technology in his book, The Lonely Man of Faith, another perspective. And both Soloveitchik and Levinas come from the Lithuanian tradition. Then I'm going to talk about the Rebbe's view, and then we're going to come back around and talk about technology again and bring everything back together. So there's the two creation stories in Genesis and Bereshit. Yeah, you have so they're dealing with Adam and his creation. So there's lots of questions about how do you reconcile these two different views. So Soloveitchik argues that there is attention.
Malcolm, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are far exceeding your time.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I
really got to wrap it, please.
And it was fascinating upcoming topic. They left the best for the end.
Yes, I'm sorry. My apologies.
So I'll jump there. That would be good.
Yeah, I'll finish up real quick. I know. I'll just bring it all together. My apologies. I didn't realize I had gone over that far. Okay, so there's these two atoms. The one is the first atom, the one is the second atom. And then basically Soloveitchik says that technology is necessary for the dignity of humankind. You know, it makes us help to live better, and it's a good thing because this is a type of imitation of God, being a maker and inventing new technology to live better, to live a better life. And this is the first atom. And the second atom is the atom that has direct relationship with God. And he believes that both of these two need to be in relationship with each other. The Tanya's view of technology is Klipa Noga, The technology is neutral, can go one way or the other. That's one way of looking. And there's a certain type of alchemy here and transformation as well. And there's a dynamism. And the other thing I would really like to talk really briefly about is this Rebbe's idea of, and with one sikha, he called this the one question that about, there was this the figure in the Torah called Hachamor, the donkey. Why is it used definite article, the donkey? And the Rebbe talks about 3 different phases of basically of what's going to happen with materiality. And I would look at this as 3 phases of what's going to happen with technology. The first phases deal with technology as more like a vehicle, right? Something that you're using, something that's hard to use and trying to figure out what's used. But eventually in the end, the Rebbe would say, like the donkey itself becomes holy, hakamor. That's why it's been with us for so long, is that technology itself will become holy. The vehicle itself, instead of just being a conduit, will be holy itself. And I just want to briefly bring over, I started off one of the write-ups of my talk was that Google has its prophecy. There's a forecast that it had back in 2014 about the way things are going to change. And in 2022, every single one of the things that they talked about is coming true today. All of our lives are dramatically changing, policies changing, identities changing. In the future of the way states and their internet policies have to change because of what's going on. We have cyber security issues, threats to governments, we have revolutions. Twitter can start things off, it can change, social media can change reality on the turn of a dime. So all these things need to be concerns. And back then in 2014, they were just saying, this is going to become an issue. And the other thing they talked about is with deep fakes, with the fake news, all these things are concerns, and we see them happening today, 8 years later. So another thing I just want to note here real quick, because moving on, is that gaming is really going to be very big with our kids. They're going to continue using it. And one of the things that's going to be used a lot is this idea of the avatar. It's like you find a lot, and a lot of gamers are very interested in different avatars and taking on different avatars, different characters. And this idea, kind of comes from a Hindu basis of avatars. He's saying now it's becoming a major part of our culture, taking on different avatars. And I don't have time to go on here, but I wanted to go show you, there's actually a website called the MetaHuman Creator, and that you could actually create a person with the skin, everything. You can create a fake human, not just an image, not just a deep fake, but like you can make it move, and you can make it talk, and you can make it act. It's like all this stuff is very controversial because this stuff will definitely be used for nefarious purposes, but kids will also use it in terms of gaming. And I know that when Mark Zuckerberg was talking about Meta, he gave an example of all these people coming to a meeting, all with different avatars talking to each other, and he's talking in a very positive way. But I'm just also letting you know that the sophistication of the software is there, and the processing capacity is there, and kids are going to be spending a lot more time developing these avatars and different types of identities. So my question is, how is Judaism going to get on these medias? How are we going to get there? So I'm going to go right to the end here. This is what I think needs to be done, and then I'll end it. Sorry for going overboard here, going over time. But what we need is, in the future, you're going to have more Judaism on gaming and VR platforms. You're going to have more Judaism in virtual communities, chats, podcasts, and it's already happening now. It's going to have to increase. Like if I'm thinking about Judaism and getting people involved with Judaism, it has to go in these 2 places. And the other thing, the last thing, which I stand behind, which I do on a daily basis, is I think there should be more coding and digital education. In fact, I'm in 2 Lubavitch schools right now, one in Chicago, one in New York. And they're the heads of these schools are very interested in promoting these things because they know that it is the future language of the future. They know how important it is to give accessibility to this language, and this gives more opportunities for us in terms not just of digital literacy, but also employability. And we need to get ahead of the curve, and that's why I'm teaching in kids' schools, not just in high schools. I'm teaching kids literally in like 1st grade and 2nd grade and 3rd grade how to code. We have teachers doing that. We have platform, we have coding, we have curriculum, and we need to give our kids a head start. That's what I'm saying. That's my last word. I'm sorry. My apologies for going overboard here.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Feuer.
Welcome.
Intriguing. Rabbi Seligson is the only one who has done it. That is, Chabad.org is out there. He described how it anticipates people. I was very impressed. It anticipates needs and addresses them before they really manifest, and that's a key to success. And as a model for as successful use of the internet,
yes,
as I know. Now, of course, that's not quite the same as social media, the interactive quality, which was indicated, but I'd be interested in that. So here we have a model, an example of a highly successful strategy for using the internet and social media for, no doubt, the kind of aims we'd like to see. Now, I'm sort of curious to know from Menachem, in general, in particular, is in presenting these ideas, is there much resistance? Like we talked about when the Rebbe broadcast on radio waves, taught to Tanya, that there's a lot of resistance to that. And it seems like any change in education and technology is met with resistance.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how that works out with what you're doing and how it works. And unfortunately, Margarita had to leave us. And what I wanted to ask is the same kind of question, is that what she proposes is marvelous. I think we all want to use the internet and social media to improve the world.
Right.
But how do you get people to do it? I think I was going to ask you, but I think from what you're saying, I got the sense that you're doing it by persuading people it's good for them to do it. Is persuasion adequate, especially you're trying to get people to modify behaviors that are extraordinarily profitable for them?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's not persuasion alone, which is what we heard, then we get to the idea of regulation, which is even more frightening to me. So it's, I don't want to say, though I have said that it's a Frankenstein, it's a golem out of control. That's what Frankenstein is. That it's the best model for what's happening today I've ever seen is in the film 2001, where the computer HAL gets its own volition, its own ends, its own self-preservation, that Trump is that is what is programmed to do, which take care of the mission and his people. Mm-hmm. And that was terrifying. Right. So I still have that. I'm not convinced that despite the wonderful efforts we see at Chabad.org and that Menachem and Margarita are trying to do, I wish you well. I hope it works. I have doubts. Gentlemen, Margarita is not here, but if you have any comments before we turn over to Rabbi Lipskar a bit, that would be wonderful.
Sure, there's a lot to say.
Sure.
I think it's important. I always tell people it's better to code out of passion than out of panic. You know, you don't want people to panic to go to out of panic. And I think that that's why I love starting with kids at young ages. They're already in it. We're in it. We can't stop it. I think I was talking to Sam. I was texting with Sam the other day. You can't stop. The robots are coming. They're coming. They are definitely here. They're going to be here very soon. They're already here. We already have in our phones, we have robots. We have the Gmail, the robots. It's machine learning. But I think there is a positive way of doing this, that we have to get involved with it, and we have to steer it from, you have to be on the ship. You can't be off the ship. Right. If you want to change the route of the ship, you have to be on the ship. You have to take control of the reins, and you have to teach the kids the language. Like what happens with a lot of kids is they want to know, are you contemporary? Are you contemporary? Like, in the end of the day, a lot of people have questions like, what's going on in the world? What are they doing? You want them to already be a part of that world, instead of, wondering what's going on there. Oh, I'm not doing that. And then I'll be honest with you, I've had people come to me from religious backgrounds who were resentful. And they told me, some people, and they said, I didn't get this education. I don't have these skills. So what I think should happen is we need to teach these kids these skills. We can't wait. You don't wait till they're 21 or 22 or 23 years old. Start early. They're panicking. I run an adult program and a kids program. The adults come panicking. The kids are not. So this is my view is I'm an advocate of technology and of coding and of learning. And I think if you got to start the kids young, and I know a lot of educators, and I know some in Chabad who are more innovative, like in Chicago or New York, who do agree with that. And they want to get the kids going, and they know it's a language. It's like you have to learn the lingua franca, the language of the people. And it's frightening. We don't know, it could, like you say, HAL 2001, that's the singularity, computers having consciousness, it's the worst dystopian idea imaginable that we're going into. but we have to have faith in that we can make it through this. And there is going to be fake. There are going to be deep fakes. There's going to be a lot of frauds coming in the future. Get ready. There's going to be fake Putins and fake President Bidens and fake all these people speaking and saying things that are not true that are going to go on. It's going to happen. But we have to. That's the world that we live in, and I don't think it's. I think it's going to be. It's too hard to say no. I don't want it. I'm going to reject that world because we're so deep into it. That's the way I look at it. And you have to take the good and fight the bad. It's like Netanya. There's going to be a struggle. There's going to be Yetzer Hara, which is going to be doing deep fakes and all these types of cyber ransomware. It's just going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So we have to fight it.
Thank you.
That's my view.
If I couldn't respond
I hope so.
to Dr. Feuer. So first of all, don't be scared. It's going to be good. And just like there are all these elements in technology that create fear, and there's motivation for bad actors to use them in nefarious ways, there are also so many more that outnumber them to find solutions to fix those problems for the good. And the other thing is, I think it's important that we come from a place of core values, right? What we're talking about are like coding language is a skill. It's a tool. And no matter what people's languages are, they could use it for something positive or something negative. But what matters is where their values are and what they're rooted in. So while one person may get coding at a young age and they want to use that to cure cancer, someone else just wants to get rich, right? And I think the important thing is what are we in parallel with those languages and skills? What are we imparting to young people? What are we teaching them of how to use those skills and how to channel that in a positive way? And I do need to correct Professor Katz. I'm one person at Chabad.org, so I can't take all the credit. So I'm sorry, Dr. Feuer, to let you down on that front. But
okay.
I think the challenge of our time is how do we channel all these things? And the stakes are extremely high, as we heard over the last 4 days. I think if there was anything that we learned over the last 4 days, it's the power, the immense power that we have. And that's something when we're looking at the Rebbe's view of this, it's an immense power that could be utilized for immense good in a way on a scale that we were never able to achieve in human history before. That we're able to impact the world around us. Just in that video, I'm not sure if my power went out before we got to that point, but you see children waving to the Rebbe in Paris, and the Rebbe's waving back at them from New York. And there were thousands, tens of thousands of Jews standing there at the foot of the Eiffel Tower, and that was taking place simultaneously in Melbourne, in Moscow, still under the Soviet regime at the time, in Israel. And I think the opportunity here is incredible. Of course, there are things that we need to work out. And in the Torah, we have the positive mitzvahs and we have the negative mitzvahs. And those negative mitzvahs are always there, and we need to be conscious of it. But if we're coming from this place of core values that are good, we're able to overcome all these things and then utilize those tools and those skills that you're teaching in an incredibly positive way.
Thank you so much. Encouraging and I think realistic words as well. Thank you both. In principle, thank you to Margarita, who did a marvelous job. And let me now ask our teacher, Rabbi Lipskar, to...
well, first, so I know this is the Suda of Melava Malka, very special time of the Jewish week that takes the holiness of Shabbos and extends it into the rest of the week, which is very significant. Our great mystics and sages always gave very special attention to this particular meal called Melava de Malka, the escorting of the queen, Shabbos being the queen. So it's a very special time. gave us an opportunity to really do a little overview of this extraordinary conference, which I really call that. Firstly, the quality of the presentations, starting from the first presentation that we had with Professor Jacobson from Stanford. It was a very extraordinary insight into the mechanics of artificial knowledge, how to integrate it and how far it can go, what are the methods and the particular factors in which it resembles in certain ways the human mind, and in some ways even can, at the present time, surpass it in certain areas. That was fascinating to get to understand that, and we had a little discussion of the Hasidic Torah perspective of intelligence, and of course the rest of the conference that addressed such important factors as the artificial intelligence period, the robotic period, a period of time when everything changes. And all these discussions leading up to tonight, and I think tonight were very important closing discussions because they were very practical. And one, I was particularly moved by a subject that I did not even know existed in terms of the academic world, which is persuasion. That's a fascinating concept, that there is a whole study directed to how to influence people's thinking, how to influence. Of course, we know that they have the logarithms that operate that, but to really enter into a much more deep psychological search into that reason and having the backup of the science, it's a little scary to a certain degree because it reminds you of the various novels that you read about the singular person that is able to bring a whole group of people into a state of craziness, which happened in Jonestown, you might say, in a radical way. It happens consistently. But here, there's a major study in a recognized Ivy League school on that subject. And then we talked about the uses and the necessity of integrating this extraordinary system, this electronic, might say, miracle of nature that is developed as a result of the development of technology, etc., to such a degree where you have instant interaction with anybody in the world at any time and so forth, total clarity, which is something that was never even thought of before. And what I take away from this process and this discussion is first to bring it onto the table of an environment that sometimes will not be exposed to this. So most people, I believe, people that I've talked to in the just recent hour, didn't hear of this concept of persuasion as well. And you're talking about secular people who are academics in their own world. So it's from that point of just putting things on the table that's at the cutting edge of what's going on today in technology and in the opportunity for human beings to utilize that is incredible. And that's very important, just so that the Torah community can hear about that from a very high level persons that are experienced in the field. The most important factor, I believe, however, is maybe a takeaway of doing the paradigm shift in Jewish education. Everybody talks about, the persuasion team was talking about peace. Everything they looked for in terms of these algorithms that create that environment that creates peace is purpose, meaning, helping someone else, hosting someone else. It's all so integrated into Torah, literally. I did not hear one single thing that was positive that was not integrated in Torah. And it tells us also the educational environment, educational system, as you heard from Dr. Feuer regarding the avatars and children. My great-grandchildren are much more adept at the computer than I am. My little 5-year-old great-grandchild said to me, is 80, can I play a game on your computer? So I was on your phone. I said, no, I don't have any games. She says, yes, you do. I said, I do not. Give me your phone. In 2 minutes, she was playing games.
Yeah.
And so the mindset, I believe, just going off tangent for a minute, because we have a code also. The whole Jewishness is based on code. If you think about it, 22 letters and 10 vowels. And each letter is a consonant, and each vowel is a sound, and the vowels are geometric lines. They're dots, lines, triangles, vertical lines, all kinds of factors. These are lines. And then the child is learning it, besides learning the 22 consonants letters, where you can put together, that's why the Hebrew text, when people are doing these word games, finding something in the 374th letter, and they put the words together. In Hebrew, it's much easier because most words can connect with other letters to make a word, and so forth, like it says in the book of Yetzirah. So that itself, a child at the earliest stage already has a computation in their mind of 22 to the power of 10. And integrated, it's extremely sophisticated if you think about it, and shapes, sounds, geometric sounds. And so already we're in a code process. And that's why I believe that there's so many great scholars today in Israel, the religious community, people who are spending time studying Torah and decided that they should do something for their country. They're in the platoon of the military that deals with the most sophisticated areas of computers, of access in those environments because of that particular area. I think we need to take it to the next step because things were mentioned here in terms of creating educational programs and access points and discussions and Jewish concepts in regards to various fields. I think we need to not put on the sideline the multiverse concept, where now people can actually experience the whole story of Exodus in color, and not the way Charleston Heston had it, but the way the Torah talks about it in certain areas. And to be able to see the building of the temple, you could actually see the parts being put together and the exact to size to scale. So I'm saying we have to rethink and start investing heavily in the area of the integration of technology and Torah concepts. So studying Gemara, and you showed people the whole discussion of two people holding on to a talus. You know, you can imagine it or you can see it. It's a whole different experience. And then the child has a much more real grasp of it, and it starts to relate itself in the way Torah should be related, which is to put it to use in our own lives. So I think this conference, thank everyone who was here. This Shabbos, we really had an extraordinary opportunity. Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, who graced our shul with a talk Friday night and Shabbos morning and Shalosh Shudas, various topics, explaining deeper levels of Torah, of love and hate among the Jewish people, particularly how it works. And of course, tonight, the utilizing genetics for identity purposes from many points of view was really extraordinary. We also had the opportunity today to have former Mayor Chaver Knesset Nir Barkat at the shul, also shared some enlightening concepts with us regarding the Israeli circumstance and what's going on there in terms of the development of the country, defense of the country. And tomorrow morning, please God, at 10 o'clock after davening, we will have a real overview of what happened in the collapse of the towers, of the search towers, by the commander of the Israeli search and rescue team that really were at the forefront and totally integrated in the process. So thank you very much, all the extraordinary guest speakers who graced our opportunity today and for the rest of the weekend. We look forward to our next conference, please God, in 2 years. And hopefully at that time, we'll have it Yerushalayim, the holy city with Mashiach. But in case whatever happens, that there's a little holdup, we definitely will have it in person, please God.
Amen to that. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you just consistently supporting these somewhat risky, edgy kind of intellectual pursuits we take at these conferences. Marvelous. You exemplify this open-mindedness yet firm basis that Chabad has always been. I want to thank a few people, and first I've got to tell you, the people who made this documentary, The Social Dilemma, were so generous. We had paid no fees. We showed it. We could do whatever we want with it. They sent me educational materials. Clearly, that documentary was not just about their profit, but they're an example of really trying to do something significant in this world, and just thank you to them. I want to thank Rabbi Lipskar. I want to thank Rabbi Rubenstein. I want to thank, of course, Lydia Hassan. This was a challenging conference to present because it didn't fit the previous models. We're going to do it here. We're going to do it virtually, in person, how we do. You know what the past couple of years have been like, and that's what we've been trying to figure out what to do. I tell you, I think we had some really great thoughts and controversies and problems and solutions to contemplate. So I thank very, very much the presenters. I'm not going to go through all the names. Some were just stunning, and all were at least excellent. So we have a good range there. We will very shortly be getting started on thinking about what we do 2 years from now here at the shul, God willing. So I'm going to be contacting the presenter to try to get a little discussion about the next one. But let me invite all of the viewers. We welcome your ideas, and it really has happened. Sometimes someone in the audience says, "Why don't you try this?" And we do. So you know the kind of topics we're interested in. Torah and science. How does technology, science, balancing with Torah, contemporary world, however we do it. So we are interested. We will continue. I trust all of the wonderful people who spoke will continue to try to, well, we all agree, to try to make this world better. That's what we're here for. And that's what we're trying to do. And these conferences, I think, help a tiny bit. Thank you so much for joining us, my friends.
Thank you very much to Dr. Katz.
Thank you.
And just to end with a word of Torah,
Please.
A concept from the Rebbe, which we read today in the Torah, that this conference is about what happened in Egypt. Because in Egypt, when Joseph met his brothers, they recognized that after 22 years, he meets his brothers, and they know and he knows. He looks him right in the eye. He says, "You guys sold me down the river." It was pretty heavy duty stuff that went on. You can imagine. In fact, the first comment he says, "It's not you guys who sent me here," which means you did something wrong, no question. It's not because of what you did that I'm here. I'm here because God put me here. And what was the difference in the two different schools of thought? And later on, just as a thought process, we read in the 10 martyrs that were murdered on Yom Kippur. This is the reason they were murdered, because the king asks him, "What happens when you kidnap a Jew? In your law, what does it say?" It says, "You got to kill him." Well, you guys kidnapped your brother. Nobody ever got killed for that. So just interesting that it was not something lost through history. But Joseph was a man that said, "God put me here, and he put me on top of Egypt." Egypt was the most developed, sophisticated country at that time. It was beyond where it's like maybe startup country Israel. They had the most brilliant people. They developed everything, papyrus, engineering, as you know, from the very pyramids. They wheel so much. It was really powerful nation. And Joseph rises to the top of that nation. You don't rise to the top of that nation by getting votes because you're a pretty boy. Rise to the top of that nation because you have the goods for it. And that's why Joseph showed us that the trip in Gullus is not to hide from Egypt. It's to take it over. It's to utilize it, which is really what this is about. So it's just appropriate that we read that in today's Torah portion. And thank you again for Dr. Katz, because he does not give you really the structure of his involvement here, but that's on a regular basis. He's the person that's in contact with all the professors, with all the speakers, vets them, finds out about them, reads some of their material. So we're very happy to have Professor Dr. Katz as the Dean of our College of Jewish Studies, and that brings a lot with it.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Goodbye.